All right, my fellow philosopher, get ready, because we're about to do a deep dive into, well, a really interesting part of intellectual history today. You gave us a pretty huge stack of sources on Harriet Taylor Mill, and, well, let's just be honest. She's kind of like a figure that's surrounded by, like, more mystery than one of those locked room puzzles that you see in a detective novel.
You know, what's so fascinating about Harriet Taylor Mill is that she was like so closely tied to John Stuart Mill. He was like one of the most celebrated thinkers of the 19th century, but like trying to separate her own intellectual contributions, I mean, like from his, has been a challenge for scholars for so long.
It's almost like you're trying to, like, I don't know, separate two different threads of thought that have been, like, woven together so tightly
Yeah.
that it's, like, hard to even tell where one ends and the other one begins.
Right.
Our main source here is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Harriet Taylor Mill.
Okay.
And to be honest, it's a pretty dense read.
Yeah.
So today, like, our goal is to unpack it all for you and explore this central question that keeps popping up. Can we actually illuminate Harriet's own philosophical light? Or will she just, like, always be in the shadow of her famous husband?
I mean, that's a question that's really been bothering historians and philosophers like for over a century, and it's
Mhm.
one that takes us right to the core of how we look at influence, collaboration, and just the very nature of like what philosophical thought even is.
Okay, so, like, before we get totally lost in this labyrinth of ideas, let's, like, start with some basic stuff.
Mm.
Harriet's life story is anything but normal. Born Harriet Hardy in 1807, married pretty young, had 3 kids, and then in 1830 she meets John Stuart Mill.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where all the intellectual fireworks start.
You know, I think what's important to remember here is the social context. Their relationship, well, it started while Harriet was still married.
Right.
So for that time, it was like a super unconventional thing to do. And they faced like so much backlash from society for their close friendship and intellectual partnership.
It's hard to even imagine, like, what people were saying about them.
Right.
I mean, we're talking Victorian England. They led largely separate lives from their spouses. John Mill was visiting Harriet, like, almost every night.
Wow.
But it seems like her husband, John Taylor, he was, like, surprisingly tolerant of all this. But he did put his foot down when Mill wanted to dedicate principles of political economy to Harriet.
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty significant detail, that block dedication.
Yeah.
I mean, Mill wanted to say publicly that Harriet was the most eminently qualified of all persons, at least in his mind, to understand and contribute to ideas about social improvement. I mean, that's a huge statement.
Absolutely. I mean, it really shows, like, just how deep their connection was intellectually, even with, everybody else kind of disapproving. But sadly, their, unconventional path to happiness, it had some tragedy in it. In 1849, John Taylor died from cancer, and Harriet and John Stuart Mill finally got to marry in 1851. But their time together was way too short because Harriet died from tuberculosis just a few years later in 1858.
You know, Mill was just crushed by her death.
Yeah.
And he actually bought a house right next to her grave in Avignon. And he spent like a lot of his remaining years there,
Wow.
which I think is a pretty powerful testament to their bond. And I mean, it just says so much about how much of an impact she had on his life.
It's a sad story, but it's here that we, like, hit the first part of the puzzle. Just how smart was Harriet Taylor Mill?
Mm.
Now, John Stuart Mill, in his autobiography, he describes her as just this, like, amazing genius and praises her intellect constantly. He describes her mind as, like, a perfect instrument and praises how sharp her mind was, her intuitive grasp of, like, really complex issues, and this profound understanding of human nature.
Yeah, and he compares her to like the poet Shelley, claiming she was so much more intellectually advanced. It's a lot of praise.
It is.
But, not everyone agreed with Mill's glowing review.
Right. There's always, like, the other side of the argument.
Yeah.
People like Thomas and Jane Carlyle, they had some, I don't know, less flattering things to say about Harriet. Jane actually went as far as calling her affected and a humbug.
Oh, wow.
And Thomas thought she was full of unwise intellect and that she would just ask all these stupid questions.
That's quite the contrast. I mean, it really makes it hard to know just how smart she was. It makes you wonder if John Stuart Mill was like, I don't know, blinded by love. Did he make her sound smarter than she was? Some scholars have even said that after, like, his really controlling father died, Mill, like, subconsciously wanted another strong intellectual figure to submit to.
Yeah.
It's getting pretty deep into psychology, but there are more balanced opinions too. Like Mill's brother George, he said that Harriet was intelligent, but he didn't praise her like John did.
Yeah.
So we have all these different opinions about Harriet's intellect. On one side, Mill's like almost worshiping her smarts, and then on the other side, people are just like, nah, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and we just need to keep looking at the evidence.
Which brings us to the next part of the mystery, the whole authorship question. We know for sure that Harriet wrote poems, book reviews, and even drafts of essays on ethics and social philosophy. And these works show, she was thinking about some pretty complex intellectual issues.
What's interesting about these early writings is that there's a theme. She's always criticizing the legal system for being so harsh on property crimes, but then being really easy on violence against women and children.
Yeah.
And, this theme really connects to her own life in a male-dominated society. And as you'll see, it's kind of like a preview of her later work on social justice.
Okay, but now we come to the, really unclear part of this debate, the authorship. John Stuart Mill, he said that Harriet was really involved in writing 3 of his biggest works, Principles of Political Economy, On Liberty, and the Enfranchisement of Women.
Right.
But figuring out, how much she actually did for each one is, well, it's pretty confusing.
Yeah, that's a debate that's been going on forever. So let's start with Principles of Political Economy. Mill said that Harriet was really important in shaping this one chapter called On the Probable Futurity of the Laboring Classes. And this chapter says that as workers get smarter and better morally, they'll want more than just money. They'll want profit sharing, employee ownership, and maybe even socialist or communist ways of working.
And Mill specifically says that Harriet inspired this chapter and that she contributed a lot to it, even calling it wholly an exposition of her thoughts. And he also says that it was Harriet who wanted him to make the book sound more progressive, moving away from those rigid, purely economic views that were common at the time.
Right. But if we go back to that dedication for principles, the one that Harriet's husband stopped, Mill calls himself the only author. And in his own list of his works, he does mention it being a joint production. But he kind of questions when he started seeing it that way. Did he always believe it, or did he change his mind later?
It's like we're putting together one of those jigsaw puzzles where some pieces are missing and some just don't seem to fit.
I know, right?
We have these hints, but actually putting it all together to get a clear picture.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah, and it gets even more mysterious when we look at On Liberty, this really important book about individual freedom, published after Harriet died, has a dedication from Mill that's super powerful but also really vague. He says that the work belongs as much to her as to me, and describes how they went through each sentence together, making the arguments better and clearer.
And he takes it even further, saying the whole mode of thinking in On Liberty was emphatically hers, and that it was their working together that turned it into a philosophic textbook with a singular, powerful truth. He really emphasizes how much they shared intellectually in creating this work.
He does, but then we go back to Mill's bibliography, and, well, he doesn't mention Harriet's involvement in On Liberty at all. And his letters, sometimes they hint at them working together, but often it's his project.
So we're back to those contradictions again. How can we make sense of all this?
There's a new tool that might help us understand things a bit better. Some recent research used stylometric analysis to look at who wrote On Liberty. So this technique uses algorithms to find these unique style fingerprints in how an author writes.
So it's linguistic detective work.
Exactly, looking at the DNA of their writing to see who wrote it. And the findings show that some parts of On Liberty were either written by Harriet on her own or with John Stuart Mill together. But it's important to remember that this method isn't perfect, and some people are still debating the data, but it does give us some good evidence that they might have written it together.
So we have conflicting accounts, vague statements, and now we have algorithms.
Right.
It's kind of overwhelming, even for a philosopher. But before we get too lost, we got to talk about what a lot of people think is the strongest evidence that Harriet was the main author, her essay, The Enfranchisement of Women.
Yeah. Published in 1851, this essay is a really powerful argument for women's equality, not just voting, but equality in every part of life. It's like a preview of the things Mill would later say in his own book, The Subjection of Women, but in some ways her arguments are even more radical.
That's interesting. How is it more radical?
Well, in The Enfranchisement of Women, she argues that married women should be able to work outside the home. This is different from The Subjection of Women, where Mill says there should be a more traditional split, wives focusing on home stuff.
So Harriet's arguing for women to be more free. including being financially independent.
Hmm.
She's not just saying they should have the same rights, but that the whole system that holds women back needs to change. That's pretty bold for that time.
Absolutely. And she says that women earning money would not only empower them, but it would also make families better morally and intellectually. It would change the power dynamics in marriages and encourage men to, like, care more about everyone and less about themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. It ties women's rights to the overall progress of society, saying everyone benefits from more equality.
Exactly. And remember, this is all happening way before the women's rights movement really gets going. Harriet was really ahead of her time in wanting this big vision of women's freedom.
It's amazing to think about how much her ideas might have influenced the development of feminist thought. But even with all this evidence for Harriet writing The Enfranchisement of Women, we still have those contradictions.
Hmm.
In some of his letters, Mill says the essay is his, even though he later admits in the preface that Harriet deserves most of the credit.
It's true, the evidence is messy. But even with all this uncertainty, most scholars today agree that Harriet was the main author of The Enfranchisement of Women. It shows how smart she was and how much she cared about social justice.
Okay, so we talked about Harriet's life, the different opinions about her intelligence, and the tricky question of authorship. But there's a much bigger question. How much did Harriet really influence John Stuart Mill's thinking overall?
Right, so now we're not just looking at specific writings.
Right.
We're trying to figure out the whole picture of their intellectual partnership.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting philosophically.
Okay, I'm ready. What do you think?
Well, first, we need to realize that Mill himself knew it was tough to separate what each of them contributed. He describes their thoughts and speculations as being completely in common, and says it was all because of their constant discussions, shared principles, and how they worked together on everything intellectually. He even says that the person who does least to the composition may contribute most to the thought, which is a pretty humble thing to say, especially from a big name in philosophy. It really makes us rethink how we usually see authorship and intellectual ownership.
It does make you think, doesn't it?
Mm.
If writing it down doesn't necessarily mean you came up with the ideas, how do we figure out where a thought really came from?
Right.
It's a question that gets to the heart of what it means to think philosophically.
Absolutely. And Mill makes it very clear that Harriet had a huge influence on his intellectual development, particularly in, like, ethics and social and political philosophy.
Yeah.
He said he learned more from her teaching than from everything else combined.
He even calls himself an interpreter of Harriet's original thinking, a mediator between her ideas and the public. It's almost like he saw himself as a way for her brilliance to shine through, admitting that he was better at organizing and explaining ideas, not coming up with them in the first place.
Right. And it raises an interesting question. What did their collaboration actually look like day to day? Mill said they talked all the time, challenged each other's ideas, and made their arguments better through this, like, shared process of making things intellectually clearer.
Okay.
It sounds like a really dynamic exchange of ideas, almost like a philosophical debate, where their individual perspectives were sharpened because they both wanted to find the truth.
It's a compelling image,
Yeah.
but I have to say, I'm also a bit skeptical. I mean, is it even possible to separate their individual contributions that much? Were they really intellectual equals, or was there, like, some imbalance of power in their relationship that might have changed how we see their collaboration?
Those are really important questions, and it's good to remember that not everyone believes everything Mill says. Lots of scholars are still skeptical about how much Harriet actually influenced him. Some say that Mill was just drawn to strong women and liked to think they were more intellectually important than they maybe were.
It's that whole muse idea, right?
Yeah,
The brilliant woman behind the great man, whose contributions are just seen as inspiration, not real intellectual partnership.
exactly. And we see this all the time, not just in philosophy, but everywhere. So how do we deal with these different stories and figure out what Harriet's role really was in shaping John Stuart Mill's thinking?
Well, I think first, we have to admit there's no easy answer. There's no, like, proof that will tell us for sure how much she influenced him. We're working with pieces of history, personal interpretations, and a whole web of personal and intellectual relationships.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean we should give up trying to understand. It just means we need to look at the evidence more carefully. We can't just say she was a genius or she was just a muse. We have to look at all the possibilities.
I like that, looking for nuance in the gray areas.
Yeah.
So what are some of these different viewpoints? How have scholars tried to, like, reinterpret their relationship and how they work together intellectually?
Well, some people have said that Harriet's biggest contribution wasn't giving Mill like fully formed philosophical arguments, but more like pushing him to care about progressive causes and making him really believe in human potential and social progress.
Okay.
So, in this view, she was like the spark for his intellectual development. She got him interested in things like women's rights, workers having more power, and a broader idea of what individual liberty could be.
That fits with what Mill said about Harriet focusing on ultimate aims and the highest realizable ideal of human life. It suggests that her influence wasn't just intellectual, but also really moral and aspirational.
Exactly. And then there are those who emphasize how important it was that Harriet was a woman living in a patriarchal society. Feminist scholars like Helen McCabe and Menaka Phillips have said that we need to think about how her unique perspective, shaped by her own struggles, might have influenced how Mill thought.
This brings up a really important point, the value of different viewpoints in shaping philosophical thought. I mean, after all, how could Mill, as a man who benefited from the same system that was oppressing women, really understand gender inequality without Harriet's insights?
Exactly. McCabe, for example, says that Harriet helped Mill understand emotions better, something his earlier, more logical philosophy didn't really deal with. She thinks Harriet encouraged him to be more empathetic, to see the world from the point of view of those who were marginalized and oppressed.
It's like she helped him expand his moral imagination. He could see beyond his own life and connect with the struggles of others on a deeper level.
And Phillips builds on this by saying that Harriet brought unique knowledge to the table as a woman who had actually experienced the limitations and injustices of patriarchy firsthand. She had insights that Mill, as a man, just couldn't have on his own.
It makes you wonder how much more interesting and nuanced Mill's philosophy would have been if he had more openly acknowledged Harriet's contributions.
Yeah.
It points to a bigger issue in the history of philosophy, doesn't it? The tendency to erase or downplay what women have done, especially when they worked with men.
It happens all the time, unfortunately. And it makes us ask, how do we tell the story of intellectual history? Whose voices get heard and whose get silenced? How might our understanding of philosophical ideas be distorted by gender bias?
It's a serious thought. So where does this leave us in our attempt to understand Harriet Taylor Mill's legacy? Is it even possible to really separate her work from John Stuart Mill's? Or are we even asking the right question?
Maybe trying to separate their work is the wrong approach. Maybe their intellectual partnership was so intertwined, so much greater than the sum of its parts, that trying to separate them doesn't do justice to the richness and complexity of how they work together.
I like that. Shifting from separation to synergy. Instead of trying to decide who gets the credit, we can appreciate how their minds work together and the unique insights that came from that collaboration.
Exactly. And we can use their story as a starting point for thinking about bigger questions, like the nature of intellectual collaboration, the role of gender in shaping philosophical ideas, and the importance of recognizing the often hidden contributions of women to the history of thought.
It seems like with Harriet Taylor Mill, finding a definite answer might be less important than the questions her story raises. Questions about authorship, influence, and the very essence of philosophical thought. It's a real testament to her lasting intellectual legacy that we're still wrestling with these questions over a century after she died.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it shows how powerful her ideas were, that they still resonate with today's concerns about gender equality, social justice, and the need for diverse perspectives to help us understand the world. It makes you wonder, how much her ideas might have influenced the development of feminist thought. But even with all this evidence that Harriet wrote The Enfranchisement of Women, we run into these contradictions again.
Yeah.
In some of his letters, Mill refers to the essay as his own work,
Wow.
even though later, in a preface, he acknowledges that Harriet deserves most of the credit.
Right.
It's true, the evidence is messy and it's definitely open to interpretation, but even with all these ambiguities, the consensus among most modern scholars is that Harriet really was the main author of The Enfranchisement of Women. And I think it stands as a really powerful testament to how smart she was and her commitment to social justice.
So we've gotten into Harriet's life story, looked at all the different opinions about how
Yeah.
intelligent she was and gone through the whole authorship question.
Yeah.
But there's this bigger question we need to deal with. What was the real nature and how big was Harriet's influence on John Stuart Mill's thinking overall?
This is where we move past looking at specific texts and try to understand the bigger picture of their intellectual partnership. And this is where things get really philosophically interesting.
All right, lay it on me. What are you thinking?
Well, first, we need to acknowledge that Mill himself knew it was hard to separate their individual contributions.
Yeah.
He talks about their thoughts and speculations as being completely in common and the result of, constant discussion, shared principles, and working together on all their intellectual projects.
Right.
He even downplays his own role as the main writer, saying that the person who contributes least to the composition may contribute most to the thought.
Wow.
I mean, that's a really humble statement, especially coming from someone considered one of the greats in philosophy. It really makes us rethink those traditional ideas we have about authorship and who owns an idea.
It does make you wonder, if just writing something down doesn't necessarily mean you thought of it, how can we really trace back where an idea came from? I mean, that question gets right to the core of what philosophical thinking even means.
Absolutely. And Mill makes it very clear that Harriet had a huge influence on his intellectual growth, especially in ethics and social and political philosophy.
Yeah.
He even said that he learned more from her teaching than he did from all other sources combined.
That's saying something.
Right. And he even describes himself as an interpreter of Harriet's original ideas, like a go-between for her thoughts and the public.
Yeah.
It's almost as if he saw himself as a channel for her brilliance, saying that his own strengths were in organizing and explaining ideas, not really in coming up with them in the first place.
So then what did this collaboration actually look like in practice?
Yeah, well, Mill said they were always in conversation, really challenging each other's assumptions and refining their arguments through this shared process of intellectual refinement. It suggests a dynamic exchange of ideas, almost like they were, sparring with each other philosophically, where their individual viewpoints were sharpened because they both wanted to find the truth.
It's a cool image,
Mm.
but honestly, I'm also a bit skeptical. I mean, can you really separate their individual contributions that much? Were they truly intellectual equals, or was there some sort of power imbalance in their relationship that maybe changed how we understand their collaboration?
I think those are important questions. And, it's worth mentioning that not everyone takes Mill's word for it.
Right.
A lot of scholars are still unsure about how much Harriet really influenced him. Some argue that Mill was just, attracted to strong-willed women and had a tendency to idealize their intellectual contributions.
It's that old idea of the muse, isn't it?
Yeah.
The brilliant woman behind the great man.
Yeah.
And her contributions are often seen as just inspiration,
Yeah.
not a real intellectual partnership.
Exactly. And this is something we see throughout history, not just in philosophy. So how do we look at these different stories and figure out what Harriet's role really was in shaping John Stuart Mill's thought?
Well, I think first we have to accept that there's no simple answer, no smoking gun that's going to definitively prove or disprove how much Harriet influenced him. We're working with fragments of history, people's interpretations, and this whole web of relationships, both personal and intellectual.
Right, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to understand. It actually encourages us to look at the evidence even more carefully. We can't just say she was a genius or she was just a muse. We have to look at all the possibilities.
I like that. Finding the nuances in the gray areas.
Yeah, exactly. And so what are some of these alternative perspectives? How have scholars tried to reinterpret their relationship and their intellectual partnership? Well, some have argued that Harriet's biggest contribution wasn't necessarily providing fully formed philosophical arguments, but more in pushing Mill towards, embracing progressive causes and really instilling in him this deep belief in human potential and social progress.
Okay.
So in this view, she was like a catalyst for his intellectual development. She pointed him towards issues like women's rights, giving workers more power, and a bigger idea of what individual liberty could be.
That seems to fit with Mill's statements about Harriet's focus on, ultimate aims and the highest realizable ideal of human life. It suggests her influence wasn't just intellectual, but also, deeply moral and aspirational.
Right. And then there are those who emphasize the importance of Harriet's lived experience as a woman in a male-dominated society. Feminist scholars like Helen McCabe and Minaka Phillips have said that we need to consider how her unique perspective, shaped by her own struggles against, societal constraints, might have influenced Mill's thinking.
That's a really important point. The value of having diverse viewpoints in shaping philosophical thought. I mean, how could Mill, as a man privileged by the very system that oppresses women, fully grasp the complexity of gender inequality without Harriet's insights?
Exactly. McCabe, for example, argues that Harriet actually helped Mill develop a more profound understanding of emotions, which is something that was often lacking in his earlier, more strictly utilitarian philosophy.
Okay.
She suggests that Harriet encouraged him to embrace empathy, to really see the world through the eyes of those who are marginalized and
It's
oppressed.
like she helped him expand his moral imagination.
Hmm.
He could see beyond his own life and connect with the struggles of others on a much deeper level.
Yeah, and Phillips builds on this by emphasizing the unique knowledge that Harriet brought to the table as a woman who had directly experienced the limitations and the injustices of the patriarchy. She had insights that Mill, as a man, just couldn't access on his own.
It makes you wonder how much richer and more nuanced Mill's philosophy might have been if he had been more open about acknowledging Harriet's contributions.
Right. It speaks to a bigger problem in the history of philosophy, doesn't it? This tendency to erase or downplay the contributions of women, especially those who collaborated with men.
It does. It happens all the time, unfortunately, and it raises important questions about how we tell the stories of intellectual history, whose voices get amplified and whose get silenced. How might our understanding of philosophical ideas be skewed because of gender bias? It's a sobering thought. So, where does all of this leave us in our effort to understand Harriet Taylor Mill's legacy? Is it even possible to truly separate her contributions from John Stuart Mill's? Or are we maybe asking the wrong question altogether?
Maybe trying to separate their contributions is the wrong way to look at it.
Yeah,
Maybe their intellectual partnership was so interconnected, so synergistic, that trying to pull them apart doesn't do justice to the richness and complexity of their shared project.
I like that. Shifting our focus from separation to synergy, instead trying to divide the credit, we can appreciate how their minds work together and the unique insights that came from that collaboration.
Exactly, and we can use their story as a way to explore bigger questions about the nature of intellectual collaboration, the role of gender in shaping philosophical ideas, and the importance of recognizing those often hidden contributions of women to the history of thought.
It seems like with Harriet Taylor Mill, trying to find one definitive answer might be less important than the questions her story makes us ask questions about authorship, influence, and what philosophical thought really is. It's a testament to her lasting intellectual impact that we're still wrestling with these questions more than a century after her death.
It really is, and it shows the power of her ideas, how they still connect with our concerns about gender equality, social justice, and the need for diverse perspectives to help us understand the world.
Yeah, it makes you think about how different our view of philosophy's history might be if we really dug into and recognized those hidden contributions. Like, what new perspectives and understandings could we find if we looked beyond the usual stories about individual geniuses and explored those often overlooked collaborations and intellectual partnerships that have actually shaped how we think?
It's a question that should make us approach the history of philosophy with a new sense of curiosity and awareness. It's not about rewriting history, but more about making our understanding of it richer by recognizing all the different voices and influences that have contributed to how it's evolved.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the life and thought of Harriet Taylor Mill, what are some key takeaways we can offer our fellow philosopher who's listening in? What insights can they take with them as they continue to explore philosophical ideas on their own?
I think, first and foremost, it's important to realize that trying to find one definitive answer about how much Harriet contributed might not be as helpful as just embracing the questions her story raises. Questions about authorship, influence, what collaboration really is, and the often hidden power dynamics in intellectual partnerships. These are questions that should keep us thinking philosophically and challenge us to really think critically about how we create narratives of intellectual history.
It reminds us that the search for knowledge is rarely a solo mission. Even those people we see as examples of individual genius were often deeply involved in networks of collaboration and intellectual exchange. And within these networks, women's voices and contributions have often been minimized or completely erased, which leaves us with an incomplete and maybe even distorted understanding of how ideas have developed over time.
Harriet Taylor Mill's story is like a powerful reminder to pay attention to these silences, to actively look for those marginalized voices, and to approach the study of philosophy with a commitment to uncover all the intellectual contributions, regardless of gender or social standing.
I think that's a great point to finish on. It's a call to action for all of us to engage with the history of philosophy in a more critical and inclusive way, to question what we think we know, and to be open to the possibility that the most groundbreaking ideas often come from the dynamic interaction of many different minds.
So, to our listener, the philosopher who sent us on this fascinating journey, we hope this deep dive has given you a richer and more nuanced understanding of Harriet Taylor Mill and the questions her life and work still raise.
And maybe it sparked a new interest in exploring the hidden histories of philosophy, where the voices of women, so long silenced or pushed to the side, might finally get the attention and recognition they deserve. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the amazing world of ideas.